Blackwood Pass, Wyoming Territory, November 1878. She hit the snow before she understood what happened. One hard shove from Jedediah's hand, and she was off the moving wagon. She screamed her sister's name. Evelyn turned, saw her, and looked away, pulling Hannah's own wool cloak tighter around her shoulders as the wagon rolled on. 20 below zero. Matches dying in the wind. Nobody coming. Then hoofbeats. A man appeared through the blizzard. Looked at her once. Didn't ask a single question. Get up. This blizzard will swallow you whole in 20 minutes. Come home with me if you want to live. She didn't know his name. Had $31 and a broken trunk in the snow. She got up anyway. This is the story of a woman left for dead and the cowboy who gave her something no one ever had. Stay with me. The wagon hit a rut, and Hannah grabbed the seat board with both hands. She'd been doing that since noon, bracing herself against every lurch, every sharp turn. Jedediah took too fast, like he was trying to shake something loose. She'd told herself it was just his driving, that he was careless, not cruel. She'd been telling herself a lot of things lately. The sky had gone the color of pewter 2 hours ago. Now it was nearly white, the clouds pressing so low. She felt she could reach up and drag her fingers through them. Snow country. Real snow country, not the light flurries she'd known back in Connecticut. Out here the mountains didn't warn you. They simply swallowed you. Storm's coming fast, Hannah said. Jedediah didn't answer. He spat tobacco juice off the side of the wagon and kept his eyes on the trail ahead. Her sister Evelyn sat beside him on the bench, wrapped in Hannah's good wool cloak. The one Hannah hadn't seen since they'd left the last relay station. Evelyn's profile was rigid, her jaw set. She wasn't looking at Hannah either. That should have told her everything. Hannah pulled her thin coat tighter and watched the tree line. Ponderosa pines crowded both sides of Blackwood Pass, their upper branches already dusted white. The wind was picking up, moaning through the rock faces above like something in pain. The temperature had been dropping steadily for the last mile, and her fingers, even balled into fists inside her gloves, had gone stiff and cold. She was thinking about the trunk. Her mother's Bible was in there, wrapped in a cotton underskirt. Her teaching certificates, $31 in coin all, that remained of her portion after the lawyers had picked the estate clean. Everything she had left in the world was in that trunk. She never saw it coming. Jedediah's elbow caught her square in the ribs, and then his hand was at her back flat, hard, deliberate, and he shoved her, just like that. No warning, no words. Hannah went off the side of the moving wagon. She hit the snow-packed ground shoulder first, and the cold came up to meet her like a wall. The air punched out of her lungs. For a moment she lay there, blinking at the gray sky, too stunned to make a sound. The wagon kept moving. She heard the wheels crunching over frozen ground, heard the horse's hooves receding, and she scrambled upright, gasping, disbelieving, and she screamed Evelyn's name. Her sister turned. Just for a moment, just long enough for Hannah to see her face, to see that Evelyn knew exactly what was happening and had known it was coming. Then Evelyn turned back around, pulled Hannah's wool cloak tighter around her own shoulders, and the wagon rolled on. Hannah stood in the middle of the pass and watched it disappear around the bend. The cold was immediate and total. Not like being chilly, not like stepping outside on a winter morning back home. This was a present something that pressed in on all sides, that found every gap in her clothing and drove straight through to the bone. Her trunk was in the snow 20 yards behind her. Jedediah must have thrown it off before she'd even woken up to what he was doing. The latch had broken on impact, and her belongings were scattered. Her certificates, half are buried already. A cotton blouse plastered against a rock, the tin of coins gleaming dully in the fading light. She gathered what she could. Her hands were already shaking. She found the Bible, the coin tin, one extra stocking. She stuffed them into the trunk and dragged it off the trail toward a cluster of boulders that offered some small break from the wind. Then she tried to build a fire. She'd read about it. She knew the principles. Dry tinder, spark, shelter the flame from the wind. She had matches a full box. Thank God. And she tore a page from the back of the Bible, an empty page, a blank end sheet, and crumpled it into a nest between two rocks. The first match blew out before she got it to the paper. The second caught, held for half a second, and then the wind took it. The third. The fourth. Her fingers were going from stiff to numb, and the motions were becoming slow, imprecise. She cupped her hands around the match head and struck it, and leaned forward to shield it with her body, and the flame sputtered and died anyway. The cold was winning. She knew this in a calm, factual way that frightened her more than panic would have. Her feet had gone quiet inside her boots. Not numb exactly, just absent, like they'd stopped reporting to the rest of her. She thought about her daughter. Marigold, who'd lived 14 months and died on a Tuesday in February with a fever that no doctor could break. Hannah had sat beside that small bed for 4 days straight and bargained with God and lost. She'd thought, in the months afterward, that she'd already survived the worst thing that could happen to her. Sitting in the snow on Blackwood Pass, she wasn't so sure anymore. She heard the horse before she saw it. Hoofbeats steady, unhurried, coming from the north along the trapline ridge. A dark shape materialized through the blowing snow. A man on horseback, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat that looked like it was made from something that had recently been alive. He pulled up short when he saw her. He didn't call out, he just looked. She must have been something to look at. A woman in a blue dress, crouched in the snow beside a broken trunk, the wreckage of her fire, attempts scattered around her in the wind, blood on her palm where she'd cut it on the trunk's broken latch. Her hair half down, her face red with cold and raw, with the crying she hadn't even realized she'd been doing. He swung down from the horse in one practiced motion. No wasted movement. He walked toward her with the kind of deliberate, even stride that didn't hurry but covered ground fast anyway, and she could see his face, now weathered, angular, dark eyes that were already reading the situation the way you'd read tracks in the snow, taking in information, making calculations. He crouched down in front of her and looked at her hands, looked at her feet, looked at the failed fire. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't offer comfort or pleasantries. He stood back up, and he said it plain, "Get up. This blizzard will swallow you whole in 20 minutes. Come home with me if you want to live." That was all. No softness in it, but no cruelty either. Just the flat, honest truth, delivered by someone who had looked at her situation and made an assessment. She was going to die out here if she stayed. He was offering an alternative. Hannah Montgomery had been a schoolteacher for 6 years. She'd read enough to know that a woman alone in the wilderness, accepting help from a stranger, carried its own risks. She'd also spent enough minutes in this cold to know that the risk of staying was certain. She got up. Her feet failed her on the first step, the numbness running from her toes up through her ankles, and she stumbled. He caught her arm, steadied her. That was all. Just steadied her, and then let go. He lifted what was left in the trunk, tucked it under one arm, and led the horse. She walked beside him because he didn't offer to put her on the horse, and she didn't ask. The wind had teeth. It drove the snow sideways, and the visibility closed down to 30 feet, then 20, then less. She kept her eyes on the back of his coat, and she walked. She thought, I don't know this man's name. I don't know where he's taking me. I have $31 in a tin and a Bible and one stocking, and that is the sum total of everything I own in this world. Then she thought, I am still walking. That is enough for now. Above them, the sky had gone fully white. The pass disappeared behind them in the storm. The pines closed in on both sides, and somewhere ahead through the dark trunks and the blinding, roaring snow, a cabin waited. She didn't know that yet. She just walked. The cabin materialized out of the storm, like something that had always been there, and simply waited to be found. It was built low and solid against the tree-lined pine logs stacked tight, the chinking between them, packed with clay and horsehair. A stone chimney pushed smoke sideways into the wind. The roof was buried under 2 feet of snow, but held without complaint. Whoever had built this place had built it to last. Wyatt pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped back to let her in first. The warmth hit her like a physical thing, not just the temperature, the smell of it. Wood smoke and pine resin and something savory simmering on the cast iron stove. Her body, which had gone mechanical in the cold, just moving one foot and then the other, seemed to sigh all at once. She stepped inside. The interior was one main room, maybe 20 feet across. Stone fireplace on the north wall, the cast iron stove beside it, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs and a wooden stool, shelves lined with tin cans, dried herbs, coils of rope, trapping tools she couldn't name, a workbench along the east wall with knives in various states of being sharpened or repaired, 2 doors at the back sleeping rooms, she guessed. Everything was spare and ordered and exactly where it needed to be. A boy sat at the table. He looked up when they came in, quick and alert, his dark eyes moving from Wyatt to Hannah and back to Wyatt. He was young 15, maybe, with a straight, serious face and black hair cut bluntly at the jaw. He wore a flannel shirt and wool trousers. A book lay open in front of him, and his finger was still holding his place on the page. Hannah stopped. The boy watched her without expression. "Waiting, Caleb," Wyatt said, setting her trunk down by the door. "Put more water on." The boy closed his book, marking his page carefully, and moved to the stove without argument. Hannah looked at Wyatt. He was already pulling off his coat, hanging it on an iron hook by the door. He was taller than she'd registered in the storm well, over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, with the lean build of someone who worked hard every day and ate what he needed and nothing more. His face was all straight lines and economy. Dark eyes, sharp jaw, a scar running through his left eyebrow. He wasn't handsome in any refined sense. He was the kind of face that belonged exactly where it was. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the chair closest to the fire. She sat. He crouched in front of her without preamble and reached for her boots. She pulled back instinctively. "Your feet are frostbit," he said. "I can see it in how you're walking. You let that go untreated, you lose toes, maybe the foot." He looked up at her level and matter-of-fact. "I've seen it happen." She let him take her boots off. He worked methodically, unlacing them with thick fingers that were surprisingly careful. When he pulled the second boot free, Hannah hissed through her teeth. Her feet were white at the toes, waxy-looking, and the sensation coming back into them was like being stabbed with small, hot needles. Wyatt filled a basin with water cool, not warm, which surprised her, and set her feet in it. "Not hot," he said, answering the question she hadn't asked. "Hot water on frozen skin does more damage. You bring the temperature back slow." She nodded. She'd learned something without asking. He moved around the room while she sat with her feet in the basin. He checked on whatever was in the pot. He said something in a low voice to Caleb that she couldn't hear, and Caleb nodded and went to the back room and came out with a folded blanket. He set it on the table near her without making eye contact, then returned to his book. Hannah watched the boy. He read with his whole attention in his hand, lips moving just slightly on the harder words, completely absorbed. Whatever he was reading, he cared about it. She wanted to see the title, but couldn't from this angle. "He lives here," she said. Not a question exactly. More like thinking out loud. 4 years now. Wyatt was at the stove with his back to her. Found him 2 days' ride north, after a fever took the rest of his family. He was 11. "He's Shoshone?" Yes, she waited for more. There wasn't any more. For Wyatt, it seemed, that was the complete story. The boy was here. The boy belonged here. There was nothing further to explain. Caleb looked up from his book then, directly at her. His expression was measured, neither hostile nor welcoming. He was taking stock of her just as carefully as she was taking stock of him. "I'm Hannah," she said. "I know," he said. "Wyatt told me when he came in." She blinked. She hadn't seen Wyatt speak to the boy when they'd entered, but then her feet had been demanding most of her attention. "What are you reading?" she asked. He held up the cover. A worn copy of Robinson Crusoe. Do you like it? He considered this seriously, which she appreciated. I like that he solves problems, Caleb said. I don't like that he thinks he's the most important person on the island. Hannah almost smiled. That's a very good observation. Caleb looked at her a moment longer, then went back to his book. Something had shifted in his posture, very slightly. Not warmth exactly. Respect, maybe, or at least the beginning of it. Wyatt set a bowl on the table in front of her. Venison stew, dense with root vegetables, steam rising in the firelit room, a heel of dark bread on the side. Eat, he said. She ate. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful, and then she had to slow herself down deliberately so she didn't look desperate. She probably still looked desperate. When the bowl was empty, Wyatt refilled it without being asked. Afterward, when the stove had warmed the room to something approaching human temperature, and her feet had recovered, enough feeling to ache properly, Wyatt pulled the wooden stool to the opposite side of the fireplace and sat down. He had a piece of leather in his hands, some kind of strap he was working oil into. He didn't look at her, just worked. You can stay, he said, until the pass clears. When will that be? Spring, March, maybe April. Depends on the year. That was 4 months. Maybe 5. I'm grateful, she said. I'm not asking for gratitude. He turned the leather over, worked the other side. I'm telling you the terms. You're welcome here until the snow breaks. I expect no disruption to how this household runs. Caleb has a schedule: chores, lessons, sleep. I have a schedule. We don't have company out here, and I didn't build this life for company. Hannah kept her voice even. I understand you'll have the back room. Caleb has the other. I sleep by the fire. He glanced up briefly. You're not a burden, but you're not a house guest either. If you can work, you work, she said. He nodded once and went back to the leather. That was the end of the conversation. Hannah looked around the room again. The shelves, the tools, the careful, deliberate order of everything. She thought about the boy with his book, and the man who had carried her broken trunk through a blizzard without being asked, and the basin of correctly temperatured water, and the refilled bowl. She thought, this man has rules because he has thought carefully about what keeps people alive. That is not coldness. That is just a different language. She didn't say any of this out loud. She sat by the fire until her feet stopped hurting, and then she went to the back room and lay down on a bunk that smelled like cedar and pine needles and was harder than anything she'd slept on in years. She was asleep inside 2 minutes. She didn't hear Wyatt move around the main room in the dark. Didn't hear him take the extra blanket from the shelf, the good one, the heavy one backed with bare hide, and push open her door with 2 fingers and lay it over her without waking her. He stood there one moment in the doorway, looking at nothing in particular, then pulled the door shut behind him and went back to his place by the fire. The storm screamed against the logs all night. The cabin didn't move. Inside, all 3 of them slept. By the second day, she had found her footing. Wyatt rose before light. By the time Hannah came out of her room, he had already stoked the fire, fed the horse, checked 2 of his closer trap lines, and started the oats. He and Caleb moved through the morning routine, the way 2 people move through a dance they've practiced. Long enough that they don't need to count the steps anymore. She learned quickly not to be in the way. She learned where the water bucket was and where the split wood was stacked, and that Caleb took his oats with no honey, and Wyatt took his with a lot, and that both of them drank their coffee black and hot. She taught Caleb geography in the afternoon, using a stub of charcoal and the back of a flour sack. He had sharp instincts for spatial reasoning, could hold a map in his head after seeing it once, and reproduce it from memory with impressive accuracy. She showed him how longitude and latitude worked, how sailors used them to find themselves in the middle of an ocean with nothing but stars for reference. Wyatt, sharpening a knife at the workbench 10 feet away, did not look up, but he stopped making noise while she talked. She noticed that. She didn't remark on it. In the evenings, Wyatt carved. Small, precise things. A new handle for a worn tool, a peg for the wall, a replacement leg for the chair nearest the door that had been wobbling since she'd arrived. One evening, she noticed him measuring the height of the repaired leg against the height of the existing ones, adjusting it, measuring again. Then she realized he was measuring it against the chair she always sat in, calibrating it to her height, so it would be steady under her specifically. He never said a word about it. She never said a word about it either. That was how respect seemed to work in this cabin. Not in announcements. In actions. In the extra blanket, and the correct water temperature, and the chair leg carved to exactly the right height. Hannah Montgomery had spent 6 years teaching children that what you do matters more than what you say. She'd believed it academically. She was starting to understand it differently now. The nightmare came on the third night. Hannah woke to a sound she couldn't immediately place. Something between a shout and a choked groan, repeated, cut off, repeated again. She lay in the dark for a moment, heart hammering, trying to determine if the noise was human or animal, or the wind finding a new way through the timbers. Then she heard it clearly. A man's voice. Not words exactly. More like the ghost of words, commands, maybe, or warnings. The kind of sounds a person makes when their mouth is working on something their mind is buried in. She got up. The main room was lit only by the dying fire, the coals throwing a low orange glow across everything. Wyatt was on his pallet by the hearth, twisted in his blankets, one arm thrown out. His face was tight, not sleeping peaceful the way people look when they're dreaming of ordinary things. It was the face of someone in a place they can't get out of. Hannah filled a cup from the water pot on the stove. It was still warm from the evening. She crossed the room quietly, crouched beside him, and pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, the way she'd learned to do for her daughter. Fever, not high, but there. She dipped a cloth in the water, wrung it out, and laid it on his forehead. His breathing changed. The rigid set of his shoulders loosened by degrees. The sounds stopped. He didn't wake up, but some part of him registered something and went quieter because of it. And Hannah sat back on her heels and waited until she was sure the nightmare had released him. In the morning, he was himself again, up before dawn, fire-stoked, efficient, and remote. He gave no indication that anything had happened. She didn't bring it up, but 2 evenings later, when Caleb was asleep and the fire had burned low, and it was just the two of them on opposite sides of the room, she said quietly, "You were in the war." Wyatt looked up from the harness he was mending. He studied her for a moment. "Union Scout," he said. 4 years. She waited. He set the harness down, looked at the fire instead of at her, which seemed to make it easier. "I had a commander named Eli Dalton," he said. "Out of Missouri. Good officer, people thought. Decorated. Respected." A pause. "He wasn't what people thought." "What happened?" "I witnessed things I won't describe to you, and I had a choice: keep quiet and keep my rank, or report what I'd seen." He was quiet for a moment. "I reported it. Court-martial proceedings. Dalton was discharged, no prison time, because he had friends in the right places." He picked the harness back up. "He's been out there since. Free man. And he has a long memory." Hannah absorbed this. "Are you in danger from him?" she asked. "I'm always watchful," he said, which was not the same as no, and they both knew it. He looked at her then. A direct, level look that carried a question he wasn't going to ask out loud. So she answered it. "I had a daughter," she said, "Marigold. She lived 14 months. She kept her voice steady, the same way she'd learned to keep it steady when she had to say it out loud. Fever took her 2 winters ago. My husband was already gone by then, influenza the year before." She smoothed the crease in her skirt. "My sister and her husband were the only family I had left." "I thought that meant something. It should have," Wyatt said. "Yes," she agreed. "It should have." Neither of them offered the other a platitude. There were no silver linings produced, no assurances that things happen for reasons or that time heals all wounds. They just sat with what had been said and let it be what it was. That had its own kind of weight, not unpleasant. After a while, Caleb's door creaked open and the boy appeared, Blinking, wanting water, Wyatt got up and filled his cup without comment. Caleb drank, looked at both of them, seemed to determine nothing alarming was happening, and went back to bed. Wyatt returned to the fire. He has nightmares sometimes, too, he said quietly. What he saw when he was 11. Do you talk about it with him? We talk about what he wants to talk about. The rest he gestured at the room, the fire, the cabin. We just show up for the next day. Hannah thought about that. Show up for the next day. Not fix it, not resolve it. Just keep appearing. She thought that was probably the most honest thing she'd heard anyone say about grief in 2 years of people trying to comfort her. She started teaching Caleb formally the next morning. She used what she had, the Bible for reading practice, her certification documents for formal letter examples, the flour sacks for writing surfaces, a stick of charcoal worn to a nub. What she didn't have in materials, she made up for in method. She'd always believed that a good teacher works with what's in front of her, not with what she wishes she had. Caleb was quick and precise in mathematics. She gave him problems, and he worked them in his head faster than she expected, then wrote the solution and the steps in careful, small handwriting. She had him explain his reasoning out loud, not to check his work, but because articulating a solution is its own kind of learning, the step that takes knowledge from something you hold to something you can use. Wyatt sharpened his knives at the workbench. He listened. She could tell by the stillness. One afternoon, she asked Caleb to read aloud from Robinson Crusoe. He read Wellgood rhythm, pausing at punctuation, raising his voice on the questions. When he hit a word he didn't know, he didn't skip it. He stopped and looked at her. Sovereign, she said before he could ask. It means having ultimate authority over something. Highest power. Caleb repeated it. Used it in a sentence without being asked to. Wyatt is sovereign over the trap lines, he said, and looked at Wyatt with the smallest suggestion of humor. Wyatt did not look up from his work. Keep reading, he said, but the corner of his mouth moved. Just slightly. Hannah filed that away. In the evenings, the routine began to settle into something almost comfortable. She cooked because she was better at it, and because it was a practical contribution, not a performance of femininity. Caleb washed the bowls. Wyatt dealt with the animals, the wood, the 100 small structural tasks a mountain cabin demanded in winter. After Caleb went to bed, they sometimes talked. Sometimes they didn't. Both seemed equally acceptable. She learned that Wyatt had been born in Ohio, that his mother had died when he was 7, that he'd raised horses since he was old enough to hold a lead rope. He'd come west after the war because he needed space between himself and everything the war had touched. He'd found this land, built the cabin with his own hands over 3 summers, and stayed. You never wanted to go back east? She asked one evening. He thought about this honestly, instead of just answering. Nothing to go back to, he said. And I'm suited to this. Mountains don't require you to explain yourself. She understood that completely. She didn't say so out loud, but she did. The blizzard outside had softened to a steady snowfall that showed no signs of stopping. The pass was buried. The trail down to the valley wouldn't be passable for months. She was here until spring. Strange thing, sitting by the fire in the low light, her feet warm, Caleb's soft breathing audible through his door, Wyatt's knife scraping quiet and regular against the whetstone. She realized she wasn't afraid of that. She'd been afraid of everything for 2 years. Her husband gone, her daughter gone, her family proving itself to be no family at all. She'd been living like a person waiting for the next blow. Out here in the middle of a Wyoming winter, completely cut off from the world, in a cabin belonging to a man who spoke in sentences of 6 words or fewer. She wasn't waiting for anything. She was just here. It was the most at rest she'd felt since before Marigold got sick. She didn't examine that too closely. Not yet, but she sat with it. The way the fire sat with the cold just beyond the logs. Patient, not moving, just present and warm and real. The thaw came slow, the way things do in the mountains. First the icicles dripped. Then the snowpack on the south-facing roof started sliding off in chunks, hitting the ground with a sound like a muffled shot. The creek at the bottom of the ridge, frozen solid since December, began to run again underneath the ice, before the ice itself gave way. You could hear it if you pressed your ear to the cold surface, water moving in the dark. Hannah heard it one morning in early March and felt something loosen in her chest that had been drawn tight for months. Spring. The pass would open. She had more complicated feelings about that than she'd expected. The last 4 months had built a life around her, without her quite noticing. The morning lessons with Caleb, the evening conversations by the fire, the rhythms of the cabin, who woke when, who ate what, whose boots went where by the door. She knew this place now. She knew its sounds at night and its smells in the morning, and she knew exactly how many steps it was from her bunk to the stove in the dark. She knew the man who'd built it, too. Not completely. Wyatt wasn't built for being completely known, but she knew the parts he showed, and she'd learned to read the parts he didn't. The set of his jaw when something worried him, the way his posture changed around Caleb when the boy was struggling with something, the fact that he never once in 4 months said a harsh word to anyone in that cabin. She packed what she had, which wasn't much. The tin of coins, the Bible, the certificates, dried and smoothed back to something presentable. A wool dress Wyatt had produced from a trunk without explanation, saying only that it had belonged to no one currently using it, and that she couldn't wear a torn blue dress into town without inviting the wrong kind of attention. She'd accepted it. No ceremony. The trail down to Bitter Creek took most of a day. The horses picked their way carefully on the wet, half-frozen mud, and Wyatt led them at a pace that respected the ground conditions rather than their impatience. Caleb rode behind, watching the tree line with those steady eyes of his, occasionally pointing out animal tracks in the softened snow. Hannah rode and looked at the valley opening up below them. Bitter Creek was a proper frontier town, or at least it was working toward being one. A main street of 8 or 9 establishments, a church with a hand-painted sign, a livery, a general store, a saloon that seemed to be doing the most business at 10 in the morning, a boarding house with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the building, and a woman standing on it who watched them ride in with her arms crossed and an expression that gave nothing away. Wyatt pulled up in front of the boarding house. "Mrs. Gable," he said, touching the brim of his hat. Wyatt Morgan. She was 60 or thereabouts, built compact and solid, with iron-gray hair pinned severely, and eyes that were doing swift, accurate work on Hannah and Caleb. "Who've you brought me?" Hannah Montgomery, widow, schoolteacher. She wintered in the cabin after being left on the pass in November. He said this, the way he said most things, plainly and in the fewest words possible, with no editorializing about what it meant or what anyone should think of it. Mrs. Gable looked at Hannah directly. "Is that true?" "Yes, ma'am," Hannah said. "You can teach?" "I can teach," Mrs. Gable uncrossed her arms. "I've got a room above the kitchen. The stovepipe runs through the wall so it stays warm. Board included if you help with breakfast service and keep the common room clean." She paused. "Fair? More than fair," Hannah said. "Thank you." The older woman nodded once and looked at Caleb with the same frank appraisal. Caleb looked back at her without flinching. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. "Caleb," she said, "there's cornbread on the back table if you're hungry." Caleb looked at Wyatt. Wyatt nodded. The boy slid off his horse and went inside with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned that accepting hospitality graciously was its own kind of dignity. Wyatt tied the horses to the post and followed. He stayed through the afternoon, helping Hannah get settled, speaking briefly to Sheriff Hollister, at the other end of the street, a lean, careful-looking man, who shook Wyatt's hand and glanced at Hannah with professional curiosity and no apparent malice. Wyatt traded some winter pelts at the general store and came back with flour, dried beans, a new length of rope, and a small box of charcoal sticks that he set on Hannah's windowsill without comment. For the classroom, she was already planning. She watched him from the window, loading the supplies onto his horse in the street below, and she understood she was not going to say what she wanted to say, because she did not have words for it that wouldn't cost her more than she was willing to spend right now. He came to the doorway of her room before he left. "The pass will hold open now till November," he said. "I know. Caleb will stay in town through spring. You can keep his lessons going." He paused. "If you're willing." "You know I am." He nodded. His hat was in his hands. He turned it once by the brim, then put it back on. "I'll be down for supplies in 3 weeks." "All right," she said. He left. She stood at the window and watched him ride up the main street and turn north toward the tree line. And she told herself the hollow feeling behind her ribs was just the adjustment of being back among people after months of mountain silence. She believed that for approximately 2 days. Then she had a classroom to build, and that occupied everything. The church basement was exactly what it sounded like. Stone floor, low ceiling, 2 small windows that let in gray morning light, 6 wooden benches that had been used for storage and smelled like it, a wood stove in the corner with a cracked door that she fixed herself using a wire hinge she talked the general store owner out of for free. She had it set up and ready inside a week. She made a list of children she'd identified in town, 8 of them, between the ages of 6 and 14, plus Caleb. She spoke to their parents directly, going door to door one afternoon with her teaching certificates in hand. Most of the parents were receptive. 2 were hesitant, asking who exactly had authorized this classroom. She told them she had authorized it, that a church basement on days the church wasn't using it required no further authorization than the willingness to show up, and that their children's education was not contingent on paperwork. Both families sent their children on the first morning. Caleb arrived with Robinson Crusoe tucked under his arm and took a seat in the second row. He was the oldest student and the most prepared academically, which Hannah suspected would create friction. She addressed it directly on day 1 before it had a chance to fester. "Everyone in this room is here to learn," she said, standing at the front with her charcoal and her flour sack teaching board. "No one is here to prove they're better than anyone else. The only competition in this classroom is with what you knew yesterday." Caleb looked straight ahead. The other children looked at Caleb. Then a 6-year-old girl in the front row raised her hand and asked what a longitude was, because she'd heard Hannah use the word to someone outside, and it sounded important. Hannah smiled. "I'm glad you asked. Let's start there." By the end of the second week, the class had settled into something functional and occasionally good. By the end of the first month, 2 of the older boys who'd been openly skeptical were doing sums with Caleb in the corner before lessons started, not out of any great social conversion, but because Caleb was fast at arithmetic, and they were competitive, and competition is its own kind of bridge. The gossip, of course, had started immediately. Small towns run on the fuel of other people's business, and Hannah had provided ample material. A widow who'd spent the winter alone in a trapper's cabin, now running an informal school in the church basement, with a Shoshone boy enrolled alongside the town's children. Any one of those details would have been enough to set tongues moving. All of them together kept the mill running at full capacity. She heard it, indirectly, at first. A comment from a woman at the store, a certain quality of silence when she walked into the boarding house common room while 2 of the long-term residents were talking. The way the wives of 2 of the town elders looked at her at Sunday service. Not hostile exactly, but measuring then, it became direct. She was chalking spelling words on the board. One Wednesday morning, when Harlan Briggs appeared in the church basement doorway, he was on the town council. Heavyset, wearing the expression of a man who had decided something and was prepared to deliver his decision. 2 other men stood behind him. He looked at Caleb, then at Hannah, then at the other children sitting on the benches. "Mrs. Montgomery," he said, "I'd like a word." "I'm in the middle of a lesson, Mr. Briggs. I'll only take a moment." She set down her charcoal, turned to face him fully, then say it here. His jaw tightened. He hadn't expected that. She'd noticed that men who came to deliver pronouncements generally expected you to step aside, so the pronouncement could be made in private, which made it easier to pretend it hadn't happened if things went wrong. She had no intention of stepping aside. "It's been brought to my attention," Briggs said, "that you've seen fit to enroll that." He glanced at Caleb, "That Indian boy alongside our children. I've enrolled every child in Bitter Creek who wants an education," Hannah said. "Yes. Now, Mrs. Montgomery, I think you can understand why some of the families in this town have concerns about." "I can understand that some families have concerns," she said. "That doesn't make those concerns correct." She looked at Briggs steadily. "Knowledge is a fundamental right of every child. A merchant's son and a Shoshone boy sit on the same bench in my classroom." Briggs blinked. Behind him, one of the other men shifted his weight. "That's a fine sentiment," Briggs said. "But the practical reality is... The practical reality is that I am conducting lessons in a church basement on days the church isn't using it. I am not drawing wages from the town. I am not using town resources. I am teaching children, including yours. Mr. Briggs, your daughter, Emma, sits in the third row, and her reading has improved considerably in 4 weeks, which I would think you'd find worth more than this conversation." Silence. Emma Briggs, 8 years old and pink with mortification, stared at her desktop. Briggs stood in the doorway for another moment. The men behind him were looking at their boots. "We'll be watching," he said finally. "I'd expect nothing less," Hannah said. She picked up her charcoal and turned back to the board. "Good morning, Mr. Briggs." She heard him leave. She heard the whisper of the children shifting, adjusting, processing what they'd just seen. She gave them a moment. "Spelling," she said, and wrote the next word on the board. Later, walking back to the boarding house in the amber late afternoon light, Hannah found Mrs. Gable on the porch. "Heard about Briggs," the older woman said. "Word travels fast. Always has." Mrs. Gable handed her a cup of coffee. "You handled it well." "I handled it the only way I knew how." That's usually what handling things well looks like. Mrs. Gable settled into her rocking chair. "For what it's worth, I think what you're doing down there is right. Always have thought it. Some people in this town have small minds. That's their problem, not yours." Hannah stood on the porch and drank her coffee and looked at the main street of Bitter Creek, going about its evening business. And she thought, "I have a room and work, and a classroom full of children, and one woman who says what she thinks and means it." 3 weeks, Wyatt had said. She didn't count the days. She was too busy for that. But she noticed when 3 weeks had passed. She noticed the following morning when his horse appeared at the top of the street. The months that followed settled into a pattern Hannah hadn't planned on, but found herself grateful for. Wyatt came down from the mountain every 3 weeks, sometimes 4. He stayed a day, sometimes 2. He traded furs at the general store, spoke with Sheriff Hollister, checked on Caleb's progress with the kind of quiet attention that wasn't hovering but was always present. In the evenings, he sat at Mrs. Gable's common room table and drank coffee while Hannah told him what Caleb had accomplished, and Caleb corrected any inaccuracies in her account with the dry precision of someone who had learned this from watching Wyatt do it. It wasn't a courtship. There were no flowers, no rides in the countryside, no lingering looks across crowded rooms. It was something quieter than that and harder to name. 2 people who had chosen to remain in each other's orbit without making a formal declaration about why. Mrs. Gable watched it with the contained satisfaction of someone who sees exactly what's happening and has decided it's good. Caleb watched it too. Once, when Hannah was helping him work through a geography problem, and she made an error in her calculation of the distance between 2 survey points, he corrected her and then added, without looking up from his work, "Wyatt says you're the most capable woman he's ever met in his life." Hannah looked at him. When did he say that? Caleb kept his eyes on the flour sack map. On the ride down last month, she said nothing. She went back to the survey problem, but she was careful after that, not to count the days between visits a little too obviously. Summer came to the valley, hot and full. The school grew. 2 more families enrolled their children in June. Word having spread to some of the outlying farms that there was a real teacher in Bitter Creek who didn't seem to care what your last name was or whether your boots matched. Hannah was running a full class of 11 students by July, ranging from 6-year-old Lily Prescott, who was learning her letters with ferocious determination, to Caleb, who was now working through a borrowed copy of a civil engineering text that Mrs. Gable had produced from some mysterious personal archive. The town council had come back twice. Both times Hannah had met them in the doorway and sent them away with the same result. Briggs had eventually stopped coming personally and sent his wife instead, which Hannah took as either a concession or a new strategy. Emma Briggs continued to sit in the third row. Her reading improved further. September arrived with the first cool mornings, the aspens turning gold in the high country, and with it came Jedediah Crant. Hannah didn't see him come into town. Didn't know he was there until Mrs. Gable told her one Thursday evening, voice carefully neutral, that a man matching her brother-in-law's description had been seen at the saloon 2 nights running, playing cards, losing badly. Hannah sat with that information for a moment. "He's alone?" she asked. "Far as anyone saw, your sister wasn't with him. She didn't sleep well that night. What she didn't know. What was happening 20 miles away in a border saloon called the Three Dogs, in a back room lit by 3 candles, and the hostile glow of men who had lost patience. Was this? Jedediah had been gambling since November. He'd taken Hannah's inheritance and converted most of it to liquor and losing hands inside 6 weeks. He'd borrowed against Evelyn's jewelry, then sold the jewelry. He'd written promissory notes to men in 3 counties who were now looking for him with the particular focus of people who have been patient long enough. The man who currently held the most paper, on Jedediah Crant, was not the type to employ lawyers. His name was Eli Dalton. He was broad and gray-templed with the posture of a military man gone cold. Not soft, not rusted, just repurposed. He'd built a small empire in the 10 years since his court-martial, mostly through land acquisition in territories where the legal framework was thin, and the muscle he employed was decisive. He had 4 men with him at the Three Dogs. 2 of them were there for appearances. The other 2 were there for the actual work. Jedediah sat across from Dalton with a losing hand face down on the table and a face that had gone the color of old tallow. "The debt," Dalton said, "is $640. Jedediah made sounds that weren't quite words. "I'm not an unreasonable man," Dalton said, which was something unreasonable men often said. He refilled his glass without offering Jedediah any. "There are alternative forms of currency." And that was when Jedediah sold them, both of them at once, bargaining with what wasn't his, the same habit that had put him at this table. In the first place, he told Dalton where Hannah was. He told Dalton that the trapper she'd wintered with Wyatt Morgan, up in the Blackwood timberland, was running a horse ranch on prime mountain land that he'd been sitting on for a decade, without any formal territorial deed on record. Dalton went very still. "Morgan," he said. "You know him." Dalton looked at his glass. "We've met." What Jedediah couldn't know, and didn't particularly care to know, was the weight of those 2 words, the history in them. He was too relieved to care. The debt was cleared, a handshake across the ruined table, and he walked out into the night air and told himself he'd done what he had to do. He was on his way out of the territory by morning. He never made it. Dalton's men found him on the southern road before dawn and persuaded him, with the particular efficiency that Dalton's men were known for, to stay available. He was going to be needed. Witness, guide, insurance, whatever the job required. Hannah didn't know any of this on the Thursday. She walked home from the classroom in the long golden light of a September afternoon. She was thinking about Caleb's engineering text and whether she could find another copy for Lily Prescott's older brother who'd shown a similar aptitude for structural problems. She was thinking about whether the stovepipe needed cleaning before the cold came back. She was thinking about the fact that Wyatt was due down from the mountain in 4 days, and that she had two things to tell him that she'd been saving up, because they were the sort of things better said in person. The trail back to the boarding house from the church cut behind the livery and along a stretch of fence line before it joined the main street. It was a shortcut Hannah used every day, 5 minutes faster than the road. She came around the back corner of the livery and found them waiting. There were 3 men. Jedediah was one of them, and he looked both triumphant and sick about it, which was the most Jedediah had ever looked like himself. The second man she didn't recognize. The third stepped forward. He was gray-templed and broad, wearing a well-cut coat that belonged in a more civilized setting than a Wyoming back alley. His eyes were pale and very calm. "Mrs. Montgomery?" he said pleasantly. "I've been hoping to make your acquaintance." She took one step backward, and Jedediah moved from the side, quick and clumsy the way frightened men move, and then there was a blade at her throat. "Don't," he said. His voice was shaking. She didn't know if that made it more or less dangerous. She went still. Eli Dalton looked at her with the pleasant expression of a man who has done this before and found it routine. "I need you to understand that this isn't personal. I need Morgan to come to me, and you're the most efficient way to accomplish that. I need his land, and I need him quiet, and one will follow the other without much trouble." "He won't come," Hannah said. Her voice came out even, which surprised her. "He will," Dalton said. "You'd be amazed what men come to when properly motivated." She heard hoofbeats, then Wyatt's horse, she thought, irrational and desperate. But they weren't coming closer. They were going away, someone leaving, not arriving. And then, from the shadow between the livery boards, she caught a movement, small. "Quick, Caleb," coming back from an errand at the store, taking his usual shortcut. He saw her. He saw the blade. He saw Dalton. His eyes met hers for 1 second. She made herself look away, made herself look at Dalton instead, because if Dalton followed her gaze, there would be nothing left for anyone. Wyatt arrived 20 minutes later. She heard him before she saw him, hoofbeats from the north road, coming fast, and something in her went hollow with relief and dread at the same time. He came around the corner of the livery and pulled up hard when he saw them. Took it all in, the blade Dalton, the other 2 men. Hannah, still and straight, not giving Jedediah the satisfaction of pulling against the knife. Wyatt's face went very quiet. "Drop the rifle," Dalton said. "Both hands where I can see them." Wyatt looked at the blade at Hannah's throat, looked at Jedediah's hand, which was shaking. Made the calculation. He dropped the Winchester. Dalton moved fast after that, a man who'd learned that hesitation costs, and the pistol came down on the side of Wyatt's head before Hannah could make a sound. He dropped without a word, face first into the dirt, blood spreading dark and fast from the wound at his temple. Hannah made a sound then. She couldn't stop it. "Don't," Dalton said, not unkindly. He nodded to his men. One of them dragged Wyatt to the fence post and bound his hands. The other went to the school cart. Hannah used to carry supplies and put a torch to it. The wood was dry. It went fast. Hannah stood and watched the cart burn and watched Wyatt unconscious in the dirt and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Not yet. Dalton bound her wrists himself, efficient as a man used to field work. "Your land deed situation," he said to Wyatt's unconscious form, a little conversationally, "is about to resolve itself." He looked at Hannah. "We're going to take a walk up to that mountain ranch. You're going to make sure Morgan cooperates when he wakes up. And when this is over, you'll have the satisfaction of knowing you behaved sensibly." He steered her toward the tree line. She went, because Wyatt was on the ground and the blade was still present, and there was nothing else to do yet, except somewhere behind her, in the dark space between the livery boards, where nobody was looking, a 15-year-old boy with sharp eyes and a trapper's knowledge of this mountain country was already running. Caleb ran, not the running of panic legs pumping without purpose. Breath ragged, no thought past the terror of the moment. He ran the way Wyatt had taught him to move, through mountain country, Low, quick, using the terrain. He went behind the feed store, crossed the alley between the barber and the hardware, came out on the far side of the main street where the light didn't reach. He stopped for 3 seconds and thought. Wyatt was down, bleeding from the head, bound to a fence post in the alley behind the livery. Hannah was being taken north, toward the tree line, toward the Blackwood Ridge, toward the ranch. Dalton had 2 men with him that Caleb had counted, plus Jedediah, who was less of a threat than the others, but had a blade and was scared, which sometimes made a person more dangerous, not less. The sheriff, that was first. He ran for the jail. Sheriff Hollister was at his desk when Caleb came through the door, hard enough to make the lamp on the windowsill rattle. He was on his feet before Caleb got a word out. The lawman's instinct, reading the boy's face and posture, and knowing already that something was badly wrong. Caleb told it fast and clean, what he'd seen, who was there, where they'd gone. He didn't editorialize. He gave Hollister the facts in the order they'd happened, the way Wyatt had always told him to report things, what you saw, what you heard, what direction they went. Hollister was reaching for his coat before Caleb finished. Then 2 of Dalton's other men walked through the front door. They weren't there for the sheriff, not directly. They were there for the same reason. Dalton had burned the cart, distraction, delay, cutting off the response before it could form. One of them said something about a fire at the supply depot on the south end of town, said it was spreading, said they'd need every man available. Hollister looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the 2 men. The supply depot was burning. He could smell it now, faintly, coming through the open door. Real smoke, real fire. Dalton had planned this piece of it carefully. Hollister was bound. 2 jurisdictions of problem and only 1 badge. He had to deal with the fire lives at risk, property, the whole south quarter of the town if the wind shifted. He had no deputy. His hands were full, and Dalton had made them full on purpose. Caleb, Hollister said quietly. I can't leave town, I know, Caleb said. You understand what that means. Yes. Hollister held his gaze for 1 long moment. Then he took a rifle down from the rack behind his desk. Not his own, a spare, and held it out. You know how to use this. Wyatt, don't be a hero. Find Morgan first. That man goes up against Dalton alone, wounded. Hollister stopped. Find Morgan first. Caleb took the rifle and went back out into the dark. He went to the alley behind the livery. Wyatt was still there. He was no longer unconscious. He had managed, at some point in the last 10 minutes, to work 1 wrist partly free of the rope. Not free enough to get loose, but enough to get his teeth to the knot. His face was dark with blood on the left side, dried already at the edges, still wet at the center. When he heard Caleb's footsteps, he went still, and then he heard which footsteps they were, and he didn't exactly relax. But the tension in his shoulders changed quality. Caleb crouched behind him and worked the knot with his fingers. How bad is your head? Caleb asked. Manageable. Can you ride? Yes. Caleb got the rope off. Wyatt stood up. He did it in 1 movement, no hands deliberate, proving something to himself about what his body could still do. He swayed once, just barely, and then he was still and his eyes were clear. Caleb handed him the rifle. Wyatt looked at it, looked at Caleb. He didn't ask where Hollister was or why Caleb was alone. He read the situation the same way he read tracks. Take in what's there, fill in the rest from experience and logic. Fire at the South Depot, Caleb said. Wyatt nodded. Dalton planned it. Yes. Wyatt checked the rifle's load. Hannah's been gone how long? 20 minutes, maybe 25. They'll move slow in the dark on that trail. Not slow enough. He headed for the livery where his horse was still stalled. Come on. A man came out of the jail across the street to tell Wyatt to wait for medical attention, that the head wound needed looking at, that going up the mountain in the dark in this condition was not a reasonable course of action. Wyatt was already in the saddle. He looked down at the man, not unkind, but absolutely clear. The law can't act fast enough up there, he said. You know the wilderness, you know that's true. The man didn't answer, because there was no answer that contradicted it. Wyatt pulled the horse's head north and rode. Caleb was right behind him. The trail into the Blackwood was black and treacherous this time of year. The aspens had dropped their leaves, and the ground was damp, and the sky had gone fully overcast. No moon, no stars. A late-season mountain storm was building from the northwest. Caleb could feel it in the air pressure, in the cold that had a wet edge to it. They rode without talking. Wyatt navigated by memory and by the feel of the ground under the horse's hooves, the way he'd been moving through this terrain for a decade. Caleb navigated the same way. They didn't need light for the parts of this mountain they'd crossed 100 times. An hour in, the snow started. Light at first, the kind that looks like it might not amount to anything. Then heavier, the wind picked up and drove it sideways, and the visibility dropped to 30 feet, then less. Wyatt didn't slow down. Caleb stayed close and watched his back and didn't think about what they were riding toward. In Dalton's camp, things were not going the way Dalton had intended. He'd set up in a shallow depression about a mile below the ranch, using the tree cover for shelter from the building storm. A fire would have helped, but Dalton wasn't foolish enough to light one. Not on a mountain where his quarry knew every shadow. His men were cold and getting colder. Jedediah was useless, sitting on a log with his coat pulled around him, oscillating between self-justification and something that looked like it might become regret if he let it. Evelyn was there too. Caleb hadn't known that from his vantage point in Bitter Creek. But she'd been waiting at the tree line with the horses while Dalton handled the business in the alley. Jedediah had collected her when they moved out. She sat now on the opposite side of the hollow from her husband, wrapped in a blanket, her face turned away from the fire they weren't allowed to build, which meant turned away from everyone. Hannah watched her. She'd been doing that since they arrived. Not staring, nothing Dalton's men would read as planning. Just watching. Taking inventory. Evelyn had barely looked at her since the alley, when their eyes had met for one moment on the trail. Evelyn had looked away fast, and her expression had been complicated enough that Hannah hadn't been able to read it clearly. She was reading it now. Evelyn was cold. She was tired. She was sitting as far from Jedediah as the physical constraints of the camp allowed, which was further than a wife typically sits from her husband in a situation like this. And twice in the last hour, she'd looked at Jedediah with an expression that wasn't fear or even resentment. It was contempt. Hannah let that sit in her mind for a moment. Then she said, quietly enough that only Evelyn could hear, "He told you the debt was my fault, didn't he?" Evelyn's head came up. "Or maybe he said I owed him something," Hannah continued. Her voice was even, almost conversational. "Or that he had to do this because of something I did, or something our family left him without. He's good at finding someone else to own his decisions." Evelyn was very still. "How much is left?" Hannah asked. "Of what he took from me. What did he do with it?" A long silence. "It's gone," Evelyn said. "Low, all of it. How long ago?" Evelyn looked at her hands. February. 8 months ago. She'd been living in Wyatt's cabin, tutoring Caleb in geography, learning to read the sounds a log cabin makes at night. And whatever small future Jedediah had promised Evelyn, they were building with Hannah's stolen money had been gone before the snow melted. "He told me it was an investment," Evelyn said. Her voice had gone tight and thin. "He said Morgan's land was worth 10 times what—" She stopped. "What he owed Dalton," Hannah finished. Evelyn didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it either. Evelyn. Hannah waited until her sister looked at her. "He sold your sister to a man like Dalton to clear a gambling debt. He didn't invest anything. He lost everything, got scared, and traded something that wasn't his to trade." She paused. "That's who you've been protecting." Across the hollow, Jedediah was watching them with the narrow eyes of someone who knows a conversation is about him and can't hear it. "Don't talk to her," he said. Hannah looked at him. "Why not?" "Because I'm telling you not to," Hannah said to Evelyn, as if Jedediah hadn't spoken. "He's afraid of you right now. Not of me, not of Dalton's men. Of you. Because you're the only one here who can actually make a choice that changes something, and he knows it." "Shut your mouth," Jedediah said, louder. Evelyn looked at her husband. It was a long, slow look, the kind that comes from the far side of something, from past whatever she'd been holding on to, and out into the open air beyond it. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were dry. She looked away from him without saying a word. His face did something complicated with that. Dalton, who had been standing at the edge of the hollow watching the storm, came back to check the ropes on Hannah's wrists. He did it without drama. He looked at Evelyn, then at Jedediah, taking his own inventory. "Keep quiet," he said, to no one in particular. He went back to the edge of the hollow and looked north toward the ranch. He was waiting for Wyatt to come to him. He was confident Wyatt would come. That confidence was not unfounded. It was based on an accurate reading of Wyatt's character, which was the thing that made Dalton genuinely dangerous. He understood what motivated people, and he used it. What he hadn't accounted for was how well Wyatt knew this mountain in the dark, or how well Caleb did. They left the horses a quarter-mile below the ranch. Wyatt tied them to a pine in a hollow where the wind noise would cover any sound the animals made. He checked the rifle again, then checked the revolver at his hip. His head still hurt. The blood had dried in a dark streak down the left side of his face, and he'd left it there because wiping it meant taking a hand off the rifle, and there were more important uses for hands right now. He crouched in the tree cover and looked at Caleb. "How many did you count?" he said. "Dalton and 2 of his men, Jedediah." "Your sister was there too," Caleb said. He meant Evelyn. Wyatt absorbed this. Where were they holding Hannah? Hands bound in front. She was sitting on the east side of a hollow below the south pasture, about a mile down the trail from the main gate. Wyatt had been in that hollow in all seasons. He knew the sight lines. He knew where the tree cover broke and where it held. He knew the sound moved differently there, depending on the wind direction, that the north face of the hollow created a channel that carried noise upward and to the left, which meant Dalton's men, if they were watching the trail, would hear anything coming from the trail, but might not hear something coming from the ridge above. He looked at Caleb. "You go wide left," he said, "up the ridge and around. Come down from the north side. If I'm moving them toward the gate, I want you above the hollow with a clear line of sight. You don't shoot unless I'm down, or they're going to run with her. You understand me?" "Yes, if I'm down," Wyatt said. "You get Hannah to the horses, and you ride south and you don't stop." Caleb looked at him without flinching. "You won't be down. I'm telling you the plan either way." "I understand the plan," Caleb said. Then quietly, "You won't be down." Wyatt put his hand briefly on the back of the boy's head, one firm press, and then he was moving. He went low and east, using the terrain the way he'd used it for a decade. Not fighting the mountain, but moving with it, putting each foot where the ground was solid and frozen rather than loose and loud. The snow was in his favor. In one sense, it muffled footsteps, laid a white surface that he could read for other people's tracks. Against him, in another sense, it also made him visible, a dark shape against white ground, if anyone was looking in the right direction. He found Dalton's position by the smell of it first. Not Fire Dalton was too smart for that, but horses. Coffee from earlier, that had seeped into a man's coat, the particular smell of several people who'd been cold and stationary for 2 hours. He stopped behind a stand of pines and looked through the branches. He could see the hollow. He could see Hannah. She was sitting on the east side, wrists bound in front of her back straight, her face turned toward whatever conversation was happening between Evelyn and Jedediah across the hollow. She wasn't slumped, wasn't defeated her. Posture was the same it always was, upright and deliberate, as if she'd decided long ago that she would carry herself that way regardless of the circumstances. Dalton was at the north edge. One of his men was at the west, watching the trail. The other was stationed behind Hannah, which was the complication. Jedediah was to the south, near the horses. Wyatt studied the positions for 2 full minutes without moving. He mapped the angles, the distances, the order in which things would have to happen. He calculated where Caleb would be by now, If the boy had moved at his usual pace up the ridge, he was above the hollow already, settling into position. Then he looked at the problem behind Hannah. The man directly behind her was the first priority. Any engagement from the front, any, shouted command. Any confrontation with Dalton. And that man's first move would be toward Hannah. Wyatt couldn't let that happen. He moved wide around the east side of the hollow, going slow now, each step placed with precision. The wind was in his face, which was good. It carried the sound of his movement away from the hollow, rather than into it. The snow was deeper up here, which slowed him, but also covered the sound of his feet. He came down behind the man, watching Hannah from the south. What happened next was fast and quiet. The man didn't have time to make a sound that carried. Wyatt caught him, dealt with him efficiently, and eased him to the ground. Non-lethal. The man would wake up with a headache and strong opinions about the situation. But he would wake up. Then he moved to the tree line at the south edge of the hollow. "Dalton," he said. His voice came out flat and carrying, cutting through the wind noise in the hollow. Everyone moved at once. Dalton turned, his men, the one at the west. Now the only one standing reached for iron. Jedediah scrambled backward off his log. Evelyn pressed herself against the hollow's earthen wall, and Hannah, in the same moment, used the 2 seconds of distraction to get to her feet and put 3 steps between herself and where the man behind her had been. She found empty space where he'd been. Looked around, confused. Wyatt was already inside the hollow. He came in from the south, and the man at the west swung toward him, and that was when the shot came from above, from the ridge. Not aimed at the man, but close enough and accurate enough that the man dove sideways and his own shot went into the dirt 5 feet to Wyatt's right. Caleb on the ridge, exactly where he should be. The man at the west took a moment to reassess his situation. He was one man, pinned between a gunfighter in the hollow below and a shooter on the ridge above, in a blinding snowstorm, with no cover and no reinforcement. He looked at Dalton. Dalton's face told him nothing useful. The man put his hands up. Wyatt didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Dalton. Dalton looked back at him across the hollow. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Snow drove between them, and the wind filled the silence. And it was just 2 men looking at each other, with a decade of unresolved history between them. "You've improved," Dalton said. "You haven't," Wyatt said. Then Jedediah, from the south side of the hollow, made the decision that frightened men make when they've run out of other options. He swung his pistol toward Wyatt's back. He didn't get the shot off. Evelyn picked up the pine log she'd been sitting beside for 2 hours. She swung it from the side, without announcement, without hesitation. It caught Jedediah across the shoulders and the side of his head, and he went down hard, the pistol spinning out into the snow. He lay still. Evelyn stood over him, holding the log with both hands, breathing hard through her nose. Her face was absolutely white. Her jaw was set. She looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at her. Something passed between them, complicated and layered, with 10 years of shared history underneath it, and the last 12 months on top, and neither of them tried to resolve all of it in the next 10 seconds because you can't. You can only acknowledge that it's there. Hannah gave her sister a single short nod. Evelyn put the log down. Wyatt and Dalton were still looking at each other across the hollow. Dalton had his hand near his weapon, but hadn't drawn. He was calculating the ridge above, Wyatt in front, the surrendered man to his west, Jedediah down, his only remaining card being that Wyatt wouldn't shoot him in cold blood. He was right about that. And he knew he was right. He'd known it since the court-martial, known that Wyatt was constitutionally incapable of doing the convenient thing when the wrong thing was in the way of it. He started to bring the weapon up. Wyatt was faster. He didn't shoot. He closed the distance in 3 steps, quick and direct, the rifle coming up sideways as a block, and caught Dalton's gun hand at the wrist before the shot was possible. He turned it, applied the specific mechanical pressure that forces a hand open, and the weapon hit the snow. He had Dalton by the front of his coat. He was looking at him from close range, close enough to see the calculation still going on behind those pale eyes, still looking for the angle, the move, the remaining leverage. There wasn't any. Wyatt held him there in the howling snow, on the ridge of the mountain that Dalton had come to take, and he felt the rage that had been living somewhere below his sternum for the better part of a decade. All the specific weight of what he'd seen, what he'd reported, what it had cost him to report it, and what it hadn't cost Dalton to walk away, and he let himself feel it completely for a few seconds. Then he stepped back. He kept Dalton at gunpoint, but he stepped back, and the barrel was steady, and his voice, when it came, was level. "You're going to stand right there," he said, "until the law arrives." Dalton looked at him. "They'll come," Wyatt said. "Hollister will get the fire dealt with, and he'll come. And you'll be standing right there when he does." "You could have finished this," Dalton said. "I know that. You had every reason. I know that, too." Dalton was quiet for a moment. Then something in his face shifted. Not quite respect, but the closest thing to it he seemed capable of producing. Wyatt didn't care what it was. He kept the gun level and waited. Hannah came to stand beside him. Not behind him, not sheltered by him, beside him, her bound wrists in front of her, her posture the same as it always was. He looked at her once, a quick assessment alive, upright, uninjured beyond the wrists, and she looked back at him with the expression of someone who has been through something and come out the far side, and is now present and accounted for. "I'm all right," she said. "I know," he said. He reached over and worked the knot on her wrists without looking away from Dalton. His hands found the rope by feel and untied it and let it fall. She rubbed her wrists and stood beside him, and they waited together. An hour later, the sound of horses came up from the South Trail. Multiple horses, moving fast despite the snow sheriff Hollister, and 2 men from town he'd deputized on the ride out, and the kind of determination that comes from a lawman who knows he was outmaneuvered and is done being outmaneuvered. Dalton was still standing in the hollow. The man from the west had not moved. Jedediah had not gotten up. Evelyn sat on the log where she'd been sitting before and stared at her hands in her lap. Caleb came down from the ridge when he heard the horses. He materialized out of the tree line at the south edge of the hollow, rifle in hand, and stood beside Wyatt on the left side, while Hannah stood on the right, and the 3 of them watched Hollister ride in. The sheriff took the scene in quickly, the way he took everything in. He dismounted and looked at Wyatt's blood-crusted face and the 2 men down and Dalton at gunpoint and Caleb on the left with a rifle that had clearly been fired. "Anyone need a doctor?" he said. "Him," Wyatt said, nodding at Jedediah. "He'll live. He just needs watching." Hollister looked at Dalton. "Eli Dalton. I have territorial warrants." He looked at his 2 deputies. "Take him." They did. Wyatt finally lowered the rifle. The cold came back immediately once the adrenaline had nowhere to go. The headache that the last 2 hours had kept at arm's length returned with full force, and the wind on the ridge was savage, and the snow was still falling, and they were all very far from anywhere warm. Hollister said, "Morgan, you need that head looked at." "Tomorrow," Wyatt said. "Tonight, it waited this long." Hollister looked at Hannah. She looked at Wyatt. "Tonight," she said. Wyatt looked at her. He considered arguing. He was very good at arguing by saying nothing. "Tonight," she said again. He put the rifle over his shoulder and turned south toward where the horses were tied. "Let's go down, then." Caleb looked at Hannah. The corner of his mouth moved in the same direction Wyatt's had, that winter, in the cabin, when Caleb had called him sovereign over the trap lines. Hannah looked back at him. "Come on," she said, and they followed Wyatt down the mountain, through the dark and the snow, the 3 of them together on the trail they all knew, going back toward the lights of the valley below. The circuit court came to Bitter Creek in early June. Judge Harlan Prescott arrived by stagecoach on a Tuesday morning, a lean man in his 60s with the unhurried manner of someone who had seen most of what human beings were capable of and had made his professional peace with it. He set up in the church, the full church, not the basement. And the town turned out the way frontier towns always turned out for court days, because justice was entertainment and spectacle, and occasionally something more than both. Hannah sat in the third row. Wyatt sat beside her. Caleb was on his other side, wearing the good wool shirt Mrs. Gable had procured for him from somewhere and pressed with evident care. He sat straight and watched the proceedings with the focused attention he brought to everything worth understanding. The charges took 30 minutes to read. Land seizure through fraudulent claim, conspiracy to commit the same. Kidden assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder. For Dalton, the original counts from the territorial warrants, now upgraded by the events on Blackwood Ridge and the testimony of 3 witnesses, 2 deputies, and a 15-year-old boy whose account of the evening was so precise and so detailed that the judge asked him twice to confirm. He'd observed these things himself. Caleb confirmed it both times. Dalton sat at the defendant's table with a lawyer he'd brought in from Cheyenne. The lawyer was good. He made procedural arguments with technical precision and objected at the correct moments and did what good lawyers do. When the evidence is overwhelming, he tried to find the gaps. There weren't many gaps. Wyatt testified for 40 minutes. He gave his account in the flat, factual cadence that was simply how he spoke, what he'd witnessed, what he'd done, in what order, for what reason. He didn't embellish and didn't minimize. Under cross-examination, he was asked whether he'd had a personal grievance against Dalton dating back to the war. Yes, he said. And isn't it possible that grievance colored your account of events? Wyatt looked at the lawyer. I testified against him in 1869 because of what I witnessed. I testified against him today because of what I witnessed. The grievance is the same. I saw what he did, and I said what I saw. The lawyer moved on. Hannah testified after Wyatt. She was composed, specific, and when the lawyer, for the defense, suggested that perhaps the events of the evening had been frightening enough to impair her recollection, she looked at him with the expression she reserved for students who had not done their preparation. I was frightened, she said. I was also paying careful attention. The two are not mutually exclusive. The verdicts came down on Thursday. Jedediah, guilty on counts of kidnapping and assault, 3 years at hard labor in the territorial prison at Laramie. Eli Dalton, guilty on all counts, including the territorial warrants. 8 years. The courtroom made noise when Dalton's sentence was read. Not quite applause. The judge had been clear about decorum. More like a collective exhale, the sound of a room releasing something it had been holding. Wyatt's face didn't change. He looked at the floor in front of him for a moment, and Hannah, sitting beside him, let him have that moment without intruding on it. She understood what 8 years represented. Not perfect justice, nothing was. But Dalton would not be on this mountain for the better part of a decade. And that was real, and it was enough to work with. After the court cleared, in the afternoon light, with the main street full of the particular energy of a town that has closed a difficult chapter, Evelyn found Hannah outside the church. She looked diminished, not physically. Her sister had always been built solid, broader through the shoulder than Hannah. Their mother's build rather than their father's, but in some less visible way. Jedediah's absence seemed to have removed a structure she'd organized herself around, even a damaging one, and now she stood in the open air of her own choices with no scaffolding. I know you have no reason to hear anything I say, Evelyn started. Say it anyway, Hannah said. Evelyn looked at the street, the horses, the ordinary business of the afternoon. I want to stay, she said, in Bitter Creek, or up at the ranch. I want to. I thought maybe I could help. With the school, with whatever you need. She looked at Hannah directly. I want to make it right. Hannah was quiet for a moment. She thought about what it would mean to say yes. Evelyn moving into the margins of this life she'd built, the daily proximity, the constant reminder, threaded into ordinary moments. She thought about what it would mean to say no, to send her sister back east alone, to close the door with finality. She thought about Marigold, and the winter on the mountain, And the morning she'd looked at Wyatt, sleeping without his nightmares for the first time, and understood that some griefs do not leave, but they do change shape. I forgive you, Hannah said. I mean that, but I want you to understand why. I forgive you, so my own soul can have peace not to give you permission to hurt me again. Forgiveness requires grace, but trust must be earned through action. Evelyn absorbed this. Her eyes were wet. She didn't try to speak through it. I've spoken with Judge Prescott, Hannah continued. The court has awarded me restitution from Jedediah's seized assets. It's not all of what was taken, but it's most of it. She paused. I've used a portion to buy you a ticket. Stagecoach east to St. Louis, and from there, train passage to Hartford. Evelyn blinked. Hannah, our cousin Margaret is in Hartford. She's decent, and her husband is decent, and they have a house with room in it. I've written her a letter. Hannah held out an envelope. She's expecting you. Evelyn looked at the envelope. She didn't take it yet. You're sending me away, she said. I'm sending you somewhere you can start over without the shadow of everything that happened here. Hannah's voice was not unkind. It was clear, the way things are clear when they've been thought through completely. If you want to earn trust back, you do it from there. Write to me. Be consistent. Show me, over time, that you've become someone different than who you were in that wagon, and then we'll see. That's all I can honestly offer you. We'll see. A long pause. Evelyn took the envelope. She left on Friday morning stage. Hannah watched it go from the porch of the boarding house, Mrs. Gable beside her. With a cup of coffee she'd pushed into Hannah's hands without being asked. They stood together and watched until the stage turned at the far end of the street. You did right, Mrs. Gable said. I hope so. Doesn't feel clean, does it? No, Hannah said. It doesn't. Right things don't always feel clean. They just feel right. Mrs. Gable went inside. Hannah finished the coffee and stood on the porch alone for a while. The morning was clear and cool. The aspens putting out the first pale suggestion of autumn color, the mountains visible above the valley in sharp relief. She thought, I am still standing. That is what I am doing. Still standing. It was enough. It had always been enough. She just understood it better now. Late spring came to Blackwood Ranch in stages, the way it always did up high. First the south-facing slopes, where the snowpack gave way to mud, and then to the first thin blades of grass. Then the north faces, slower, grudging about it, the pine shadows holding cold longer than anywhere else. Then the high meadow above the tree line, which went from white to gold to green over the course of 2 weeks in May, the wildflowers coming in all at once, as if they'd been waiting in a locked room, and someone had finally turned the key. Hannah had moved up to the ranch in March. The decision hadn't been dramatic. She'd simply looked at the logistics one afternoon. The school, the boarding house, the daily ride up and down the mountain, and weighed them against the fact that a schoolhouse could be built on the ridge as easily as in a valley, and that she was spending more days up here than down there anyway, and that the cabin had become the place she thought of when she thought of the word home. She mentioned it to Wyatt in the same tone she used for practical matters. He'd said, There's a room that needs a new windowsill. I'll put one in. She'd moved up the following week. The schoolhouse went up in April. Wyatt and Caleb building the frame over 3 weekends, Hannah doing the chinking and the window installation, and the construction of 8 small desks from split pine. Mountain families, 4 of them, isolated on their homesteads, through the winter months had children who needed teaching, and the Ridge Schoolhouse was closer to them than anything in the valley. She opened it on a Monday morning with 6 students. Caleb was not among them. He'd aged past the formal classroom, and he knew it, and he'd told her so with the directness that was simply his nature. I learned more working the ranch, he said. You taught me how to keep teaching myself. That's the part that matters, she'd agreed. Because it was true, and because a good teacher's best outcome is a student who no longer needs the classroom. He was with Wyatt in the lower pasture when she opened the schoolhouse, working the spring horses, and she could hear them from the window sometimes. Wyatt's low voice, Caleb's response, the particular back and forth of two people who have built a language between them out of shared work and shared years. The ranch was becoming something. Not just a trapper's outpost anymore. Wyatt had been breeding horses since before Hannah arrived, quietly, without advertising it, and word had gotten around the territory the way word does about quality. 4 buyers had come up the mountain in May alone. He was expanding the operation, adding a second pasture, talking to Caleb about the structural requirements of a proper stable, drawing plans on paper with the same careful precision he brought to everything. Hannah watched him draw plans one evening in early June. He was at the table by the window, the last of the sunlight coming in at a low angle, and he was working on the stable layout with a stub of pencil and a straight edge made from a scrap of board. He erased and redrew the eastern wall 3 times because the angle wasn't right, and he wouldn't accept an angle that wasn't right. She was grading the work her students had done that week: geography problems, reading passages, a set of arithmetic exercises she'd modeled on the engineering text Caleb had grown attached to. They worked in comfortable parallel for an hour. Then Wyatt set down the pencil. He sat back in his chair and looked at the plans, and then he looked at Hannah across the table. He looked at her for long enough that she looked up from the papers. He had something in his hand. She hadn't seen him pick it up. He held it out. It was a pendant, roughly an inch across, cut from some dark reddish wood she didn't immediately recognize. He'd carved it himself. She could see the tool marks where he'd worked the surface smooth, and the design pressed into the face of it, a snowflake, its 6 arms precise and symmetrical, and woven through the center of it, a small flame shape, the two overlapping where they met in the middle. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him. He wasn't a man who rehearsed things. He said them when they were ready, and he didn't dress them up. "I don't have a velvet parlor to offer you, Hannah," he said, "but on this mountain, you are my equal partner. I promise to guard your freedom and your happiness with my life." The evening light was on his face. The mountains were visible through the window. Behind him, the high peaks still holding their last snow. She thought about the pass in November. The cold, the wind, the man who had appeared out of the storm and said, "Get up," and meant it with his whole self. She thought about bear hide blankets and correctly temperatured water and chair legs carved to the right height, and 4 months of winter translated into the language of practical care. She thought about Marigold and grief, and the fact that you can carry the people you've lost and still reach for something new, that the two are not in competition. She picked up the pendant, turned it over. On the back, in small, careful letters, BW 1879. Blackwood, their year. "Yes," she said. He looked at her across the table. "Yes, that's my answer." "Yes." He nodded once. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise, but a loosening, like a tension he'd been holding for a long time, had finally found somewhere to go. He reached across the table and closed his hand over hers, the pendant between them. They sat like that for a while, in the last of the evening light, and the mountains held still outside the window, and the horses moved in the lower pasture, and, from the bunk room at the back, they could hear Caleb working through a calculation out loud the way he did when he was trying to solve something, talking to himself in a low murmur. The sound of the 3 of them in that house. It was the most ordinary sound in the world. Hannah held on to it like it was the rarest thing she'd ever heard. Because it was. Autumn came to Blackwood Ranch in the last week of October. One year, almost to the day, from the morning Hannah had woken in a boarding house room above Mrs. Gable's kitchen and looked out at the first real snow of the season and understood she was going to be all right. The aspens had gone gold across the whole ridge. In the mornings, the frost came hard and early, putting lacework on the window panes, and the horse's breath steamed in the pasture at dawn. The air had the clean, sharp quality that only happens at altitude in autumn. A smell of pine and cold stone and distance. The schoolhouse on the ridge was full, 8 students now, ranging from 5 to 13. Hannah had added a reading hour on Friday afternoons, which had turned into something more than a reading hour, because once children discover that stories are portable, that you can carry them with you after the lesson ends, that they change the color of an ordinary afternoon, they tend to want more of them. She'd written to a bookseller in Chicago in June. The first shipment had arrived in September, 12 volumes wrapped in oilcloth, and the look on Lily Prescott's face when she'd been handed her own copy of a book hers to keep, to carry home, to read under her blankets by candlelight, was the kind of thing Hannah kept in the category of reasons. Caleb was running the south pasture now, not running it under supervision, with Wyatt watching for errors and correcting course. Running it, he managed the breeding schedule, the feeding rotation, the water access in cold weather, the records of which mare had been bred, to which stallion, and when the foals were due. He kept the records in a ledger he'd set up himself, the system clean and logical, cross-referenced by date and bloodline. Wyatt had handed him responsibility the way he handed most things, without ceremony, simply increasing Caleb's authority until it was complete. The transfer of trust was so gradual it was almost invisible, which Hannah suspected was intentional. You don't feel the weight of real responsibility if you've grown into it slowly enough. She'd told Caleb that once, directly. He'd considered it seriously, and said, "That's what you did with the students. You gave them harder problems before they knew they could do harder problems." "Yes," she'd said. "It works," he said, and went back to the ledger. The baby came on a Thursday. Not on schedule, 2 weeks earlier than expected, which was the first evidence that this particular person intended to do things in his own time. Wyatt had ridden for Mrs. Gable before dawn, covering the mountain trail at a speed that would have alarmed Hannah if she'd been in any condition to be alarmed about anything other than the immediate situation. Mrs. Gable arrived with her bag and her no-nonsense manner and her 60 years of having seen most things. And by mid-morning, there was a new person in the world, a boy. He was healthy and loud about being healthy, which Mrs. Gable said was the best possible start. He had Wyatt's dark coloring and Hannah's stubbornness, visible even in the first hours in the set of his small jaw, in the way he gripped whatever he could reach and didn't let go. They named him James, James Wyatt Morgan. Caleb appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, an hour after the birth, hat in his hands, wearing the expression of someone trying to look composed about something that was not, in fact, leaving him composed. Hannah held the baby out toward him. He came in slowly, sat on the edge of the chair beside the bed, looked at the baby in Hannah's arms for a long moment. "He's very small," Caleb said. "He'll get bigger," Wyatt said from the corner. "I know that." Caleb looked up. "I meant," he stopped. "Tried again. He's going to need someone to teach him things." "He is?" Hannah said. "I can teach him the horses," Caleb said, "when he's old enough." He said it with the careful tone of someone making an offer they've thought about and mean seriously. "I know you can," she said. Caleb looked at the baby again. Something in his face, the composed, measured face of the 15-year-old she'd met in a mountain cabin 4 years ago, went briefly young, not less serious, just young and open and present. "He's going to be all right," Caleb said. "Being born up here, he's going to be more than all right," Hannah said. Wyatt walked to the window. The high pass was visible from there. On clear days, the cut in the ridge, where the trail came through from the eastern side of the mountain. You couldn't see it today, cloud cover, the suggestion of weather building, but he knew exactly where it was. He'd known this mountain long enough to hold its whole geography in his mind, every trail and rock face and hollow, the places where the wind changed direction, and the places where the snow came first. He thought about November a year ago, the blood on the snow, and the broken trunk, and the woman in the blue dress who had gotten up when he told her to get up, who had walked through a blizzard beside him, because the alternative was worse. And she was someone who did what needed doing. He thought about everything that had been built since then. Not just the stable and the schoolhouse and the second pasture. The other things, the harder things to name. Hannah watched him at the window. She had thought, in the worst months after Marigold, that the story was over, that she had loved people and lost them, and that the world was organized in such a way that the things you valued would be taken from you, and eventually there would be nothing left to take. She'd been wrong. Not wrong. That loss was real, or that grief was real, or that people failed each other in ways that left permanent marks. All of that was true. She'd been wrong about the ending. She'd thought she could see it from where she was standing. You almost never can. From where she was standing now, she could see this. A man at a window, who had built his life with his hands and shared it without fanfare. A boy in a chair learning what it meant to be part of something. A baby in her arms who had not yet encountered a single obstacle and was in absolutely no hurry about any of it. A schoolhouse 50 yards from the door, empty today, full tomorrow. A mountain that had tried to kill her once and become her home. She looked at Wyatt, and he turned from the window and looked back at her, and in the low autumn light of the room that was theirs, she understood something she'd been working toward for a year. Without knowing it, being left on that pass in the snow was not the worst thing that had ever happened to her. It was the path. Not because suffering is good, or because what Jedediah did was forgivable because of what came after it wasn't, and no outcome changed that, but because she had walked the path anyway. She had gotten up when told to get up. She had worked and taught and stood her ground and built something out of what was left. The abandoned woman in the blizzard had not been rescued. She had survived and chosen and arrived. That was different. That was everything. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and early, drifting past the window in no particular hurry, settling on the pasture fence and the roof of the schoolhouse and the high branches of the pines. The mountains disappeared into white. Inside, the fire was going. James Wyatt Morgan made a small sound against his mother's shoulder. Not distress, just presence. Just announcing himself to whatever room this was, in whatever world this turned out to be. Hannah pressed her lips to the top of his head. Wyatt came back from the window and sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at his son for a long moment. Then he put his arm around Hannah's shoulders, carefully, and she leaned into him, and the three of them, four, counting Caleb in the chair, which she always did, sat together in the firelit room, while the first snow of autumn fell on Blackwood Ranch. 1 year, from the past to here. There's something this story keeps coming back to, and I want to talk about it before we close. Hannah Montgomery didn't get rescued. That's the part people miss when they hear a story like this. A man on horseback shows up in a blizzard, says 4 words, and it's easy to think, oh, she was saved. But that's not what happened. What happened is that she got up, on frozen feet, in a torn dress, with $31 and no plan. She got up and she walked. Nobody carried her. Nobody fixed it for her. She just kept moving in the only direction that made sense, and she did that every single day after in the cabin, in the classroom, in that basement in Bitter Creek, when Harlan Briggs showed up expecting her to step aside, on the mountain in the dark, when Dalton had a blade at her throat. Every time she got up. That's not rescue. That's survival. And there's a difference that matters. The second thing this story is about is what real respect actually looks like. Not what it sounds like, what it looks like. Wyatt Morgan never gave a speech about Hannah's worth, or her intelligence, or her right to be treated as an equal. He treated Frostbite correctly. He refilled her bowl. He carved a chair leg to exactly her height and never mentioned it. He built her a schoolhouse on a mountain ridge and stepped back and let her fill it. That's the language some people speak, not in declarations, but in 10,000 small, deliberate choices that say, I see you, and I think you're worth the effort. That kind of respect is quieter than the kind in movies. It's also harder to fake, and it lasts longer. And then there's forgiveness. Hannah's conversation with Evelyn outside the courthouse is the scene I keep thinking about. She didn't forgive her sister to be noble. She didn't forgive her to give Evelyn another chance to hurt her. She said it plainly. I forgive you so my own soul can have peace. That's not weakness. That's one of the most precise and self-aware things a person can do. Understand that holding on to poison doesn't hurt the person who handed it to you. It only hurts the person carrying it. She bought her sister a ticket east and sent her away with grace and with boundaries intact and with zero confusion about what forgiveness does and doesn't mean. It means you put the weight down. It does not mean you hand someone the key to hurt you again. That distinction is worth carrying with you. The last thing. Hannah stood on that boarding house porch in the autumn light, a year after the blizzard, and she understood something she hadn't been able to see from where she'd been standing in the snow. Being abandoned on that pass wasn't the end of her story. It was the path. Not because suffering is good, or because what Jedediah did deserves to be reframed as a gift it doesn't, but because she walked the path anyway. She showed up for the next day, and the day after that, and eventually the next day looked like a schoolhouse full of children, and a man who proposed with a hand-carved snowflake, and meant every word of it. You almost never can see where a path is going from the beginning. That's not a reason to stop walking. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary, and any resemblance to real persons or places is coincidental.